Runaway. Carla heard the car coming before it topped the little rise in the rows that around here they called a hill. It's her, she thought. Mrs. Jamieson, a Sylvia, home from her holiday in Greece. From the barn door but far enough inside that she could not readily be seen as she watched the road Mrs. Jamieson would have to drive by on, her place being half a mile farther along the road than Clark and Carla's. If it was somebody getting ready to turn in at their gate, it would be slowing down by now. But still Carla hoped. Let it not be her. It was. Mrs. Jamieson turned her head once, quickly as she had all she could do, maneuvering her car through the ruts and puddles the rain had made in the gravel, but she didn't lift a hand off the wheel to wave. She didn't spot Carla. Carla got a glimpse of a tan arm bare to the shoulder, hair bleached a lighter color than it had been before, more white now than silver blonde, and an expression that was determined and exasperated and amused at her own exasperation and just the way Mrs. Jamieson would look negotiating such a road. When she turned her head there was something like a bright flash of inquiry, of hopefulness that made Carla shrink back. So, maybe Clark didn't know yet. If he was sitting at the computer he would have his back to the window in the road. But Mrs. Jamieson might have to make another trip. Driving home from the airport, she might not have stopped for groceries, and not until she'd been home and figured out what she needed. Clark might see her then. And after dark, the lights of her house would show. But this was July, and it didn't get dark till late. She might be so tired that she wouldn't bother with the lights, she might go to bed early. On the other hand, she might telephone. Any time now. This was the summer of rain and more rain. You heard it first thing in the morning, loud on the roof of the mobile home. The trails were deep in mud, the long grass soaking, leaves overhead sending down random showers even in those moments when there was no actual downpour from the sky and the clouds looked like clearing. Carla wore a high, wide-brimmed old Australian felt hat every time she went outside, and tucked her long thick braid down her shirt. Nobody showed up for trail rides, even though Clark and Carla had gone around posting signs in all the camping sites, in the cafes, and on the tourist office billboard and anywhere else they could think of. Only a few pupils were coming for lessons, and those were regulars, not the batches of school children on vacation, the busloads from summer camps, that had kept them going through last summer. And even the regulars that they counted on were taking time off for holiday trips, or simply canceling their lessons because of the weather being so discouraging. If they called too late, Clark charged them for the time anyway. A couple of them had complained, and quit for good. There was still some income from the 3 horses that were boarded. Those 3, and the 4 of their own, were out in the field now, poking around in the grass under the trees. They looked as if they couldn't be bothered to notice that the rain was holding off for the moment, the way it often did for a while in the afternoon. Just enough to get your hopes up at the clouds widening and thinning and letting through a diffuse brightness that never got around to being real sunshine, and was usually gone before supper. Carla had finished mucking out in the barn. She had taken her time as she liked the rhythm of her regular chores, the high space under the barn roof, the smells. Now she went over to the exercise ring to see how dry the ground was, in case the 5 o'clock pupil did show up. Most of the steady showers had not been particularly heavy, or borne on any wind, but last week there had come a sudden stirring and then a blast through the treetops and a nearly horizontal blinding rain. In a quarter of an hour the storm had passed over. But branches lay across the road, hydro lines were down, and a large chunk of the plastic roofing over the ring had been torn loose. There was a puddle like a lake at that end of the track, and Clark had worked until after dark, digging a channel to drain it away. The roof had not yet been repaired. Clark had strung fence wire across to keep the horses from getting into the mud, and Carla had marked out a shorter track. On the web, right now, Clark was hunting for some place to buy roofing. Some salvage outlet, with prices that they could afford, or somebody trying to get rid of such material secondhand. He would not go to High and Robert Buckley's building supply in town, which he called Highway Robbers Buggery Supply, because he owed them too much money and had had a fight with them. Clark had fights not just with the people he owed money to. His friendliness, compelling at first, could suddenly turn sour. There were places he would not go into, where he always made Carla go, because of some row. The drugstore was one such place. An old woman had pushed in front of him, that is, she had gone to get something she'd forgotten and come back and pushed in front, rather than going to the end of the line, and he had complained, and the cashier had said to him, "She has emphysema," and Clark had said, "Is that so? I have piles, myself," and the manager had been summoned, to say that was uncalled for. And in the coffee shop out on the highway the advertised breakfast discount had not been allowed, because it was past 11 o'clock in the morning, and Clark had argued and then dropped his take-out cup of coffee on the floor, just missing, so they said, a child in its stroller. He said the child was half a mile away and he dropped the cup because no cuff had been provided. They said he had not asked for a cuff. He said he shouldn't have had to ask. "You flare up," said Carla. "That's what men do." She had not said anything to him about his row with Joy Tucker. Joy Tucker was the librarian from town who boarded her horse with them. The horse was a quick-tempered little chestnut mare named Leah. Joy Tucker, when she was in a jokey mood, called her Lizzie Borden. Yesterday she had driven out, not in a jokey mood at all, and complained about the roofs not being fixed yet, and Lizzie looking miserable, as if she might have caught a chill. There was nothing the matter with Lizzie, actually. Clark had treated for him to be placating. But then it was Joy Tucker who flared up and said that their place was a dump, and Lizzie deserved better, and Clark said, "Suit yourself." Joy had not yet removed Lizzie, as Carla had expected. But Clark, who had formerly made the little mare his pet, had refused to have anything more to do with her. Lizzie's feelings were hurt, in consequence as she was balky when exercised and kicked up a fuss when her hoofs had to be picked out, as they did every day, lest they develop a fungus. Carla had to watch out for nips. But the worst thing as far as Carla was concerned was the absence of Flora, the little white goat who kept the horses company in the barn and in the fields. There had not been any sign of her for 2 days. Carla was afraid that wild dogs or coyotes had got her, or even a bear. She had dreamt of Flora last night and the night before. In the first dream Flora had walked right up to the bed with a red apple in her mouth, but in the second dream last night she had run away when she saw Carla coming. Her legs seemed to be hurt but she ran anyway. She led Carla to a barbed wire barricade of the kind that might belong on some battlefield, and then Flora slipped through it, hurt leg and all, just slithered through like a white eel and disappeared. The horses had seen Carla go across to the ring and they had all moved up to the fence looking bedraggled in spite of their New Zealand blankets so that she would take notice of them on her way back. She talked quietly to them, apologizing for coming empty-handed. She stroked their necks and rubbed their noses and asked whether they knew anything about Flora. Grace and Juniper snorted and nuzzled up, as if they recognized the name and shared her concern, but then Lizzie butted in between them and knocked Grace's head away from Carla's petting hand. She gave the hand a nip for good measure, and Carla had to spend some time scolding her. Up until 3 years ago Carla never really looked at mobile homes. She didn't call them that, either. Like her parents, she would have thought mobile home pretentious. Some people lived in trailers, and that was all there was to it. One trailer was no different from another. When Carla moved in here, when she chose this life with Clark, she began to see things in a new way. After that she started saying mobile home and she looked to see how people had fixed them up. The kind of curtains they had hung, the way they had painted the trim, the ambitious decks or patios or extra rooms that had been built on. She could hardly wait to get at such improvements herself. Clark had gone along with her ideas, for a while. He had built new steps, and spent a lot of time looking for an old wrought iron railing for them. He didn't make any complaint about the money spent on paint for the kitchen and bathroom or the material for curtains. Her paint job was hasty. She didn't know, at that time, that you should take the hinges off the cupboard doors. Or that you should line the curtains, which had since faded. What Clark balked at was tearing up the carpet, which was the same in every room and the thing that she had most counted on replacing. It was divided into small brown squares, each with a pattern of darker brown and rust and tan squiggles and shapes. For a long time she had thought these were the same squiggles and shapes, arranged in the same way, in each square. Then when she had had more time, a lot of time, to examine them, she decided that there were 4 patterns joined together to make identical larger squares. Sometimes she could pick at the arrangement easily and sometimes she had to work to see it. She did this when it was raining outside and Clark's mood weighted down all their inside space, and he did not want to pay attention to anything but the computer screen. But the best thing to do then was to invent or remember some job to do in the barn. The horses would not look at her when she was unhappy, but Flora, who was never tied up, would come and rub against her, and look up with an expression that was not quite sympathy, it was more like comradely mockery in her shimmering yellow-green eyes. Flora had been a half-grown kid when Clark brought her home from a farm where he had gone to bargain for some horse tackle. The people there were giving up on the country life, or at least on the raising of animals. They had sold their horses but failed to get rid of their goats. He had heard about how a goat was able to bring a sense of ease and comfort into a horse stable and he wanted to try it. They had meant to breed her someday but there had never been any signs of her coming into heat. At first she had been Clark's pet entirely, following him everywhere, dancing for his attention. She was quick and graceful and provocative as a kitten, and her resemblance to a guileless girl in love had made them both laugh. But as she grew older she seemed to attach herself to Carla, and in this attachment she was suddenly much wiser, less skittish as she seemed capable, instead, of a subdued and ironic sort of humor. Carla's behavior with the horses was tender and strict and rather maternal, but the comradeship with Flora was quite different, Flora allowing her no sense of superiority. "Still no sign of Flora?" she said, as she pulled off her barn boots. Clark had posted a lost goat notice on the web. "Not so far," he said, in a preoccupied but not unfriendly voice. He suggested, not for the first time, that Flora might have just gone off to find herself a billy. "No word about Mrs. Jameson." Carla put the kettle on. Clark was humming to himself as he often did when he sat in front of the computer. Sometimes he talked back to it. "Bullshit," he would say, replying to some challenge. Or he would laugh but could not remember what the joke was, when she asked him afterwards. Carla called, "Do you want tea?" And to her surprise he got up and came into the kitchen. "So," he said. "So, Carla." "What?" "So she phoned." "Who?" "Her Majesty. Queen Sylvia. She just got back." "I didn't hear the car." "I didn't ask you if you did." "So what did she phone for?" "She wants you to go and help her straighten up the house." "That's what she said." "Tomorrow." "What did you tell her?" "I told her sure. But you better phone up and confirm." Carla said, "I don't see why I have to, if you told her." She poured out their mugs of tea. "I cleaned up her house before she left. I don't see what there could be to do so soon. Maybe some coons got in and made a mess of it while she was gone. You never know." "I don't have to phone her right this minute," she said. "I want to drink my tea and I want to have a shower. The sooner the better." Carla took her tea into the bathroom, calling back, "We have to go to the laundromat. Even when the towels dry out they smell moldy." "We're not changing the subject, Carla." Even after she'd got in the shower he stood outside the door and called to her. "I am not going to let you off the hook, Carla." She thought he might still be standing there when she came out, but he was back at the computer. She dressed as if she was going to town as she hoped that if they could get out of here, go to the laundromat, get a takeout at the cappuccino place, they might be able to talk in a different way, some release might be possible. She went into the living room with a brisk step and put her arms around him from behind. But as soon as she did that a wave of grief swallowed her up. It must have been the heat of the shower, loosening her tears, and she bent over him, all crumbling and crying. He took his hands off the keyboard but sat still. "Just don't be mad at me," she said. "I'm not mad. I hate when you're like this, that's all. I'm like this because you're mad. Don't tell me what I am. You're choking me. Start supper." That was what she did. It was obvious by now that the 5 o'clock person wasn't coming. She got out the potatoes and began to peel them, but her tears would not stop and she could not see what she was doing. She wiped her face with a paper towel and tore off a fresh one to take with her and went out into the rain. She didn't go into the barn because it was too miserable in there without Flora. She walked along the lane back to the woods. The horses were in the other field. They came over to the fence to watch her. All of them except Lizzie, who capered and snorted a bit, had the sense to understand that her attention was elsewhere. It had started when they read the obituary, Mr. Jameson's obituary. That was in the city paper, and his face had been on the evening news. Up until the year before, they had known the Jamesons only as neighbors who kept to themselves. She taught botany at the college 40 miles away, so she had to spend a good deal of her time on the road. He was a poet. Everybody knew that much. But he seemed to be occupied with other things. For a poet, and for an old man of perhaps 20 years older than Mrs. Jameson, he was rugged and active. He improved the drainage system on his place, cleaning out the culvert and lining it with rocks. He dug and planted and fenced a vegetable garden, cut paths through the woods, looked after repairs on the house. The house itself was an odd-looking triangular affair that he had built years ago, with some friends, on the foundation of an old wrecked farmhouse. Those people were spoken of as hippies, though Mr. Jameson must have been a bit old for that, even then, before Mrs. Jameson's time. There was a story that they grew marijuana in the woods, sold it, and stored the money in sealed glass jars, which were buried around the property. Clark had heard this from the people he got to know in town. He said it was bullshit. Else somebody would have got in and dug it up, before now. Somebody would have found a way to make him tell where it was. When they read the obituary, Carla and Clark learned for the first time that Leon Jameson had been the recipient of a large prize, 5 years before his death. A prize for poetry. Nobody had ever mentioned this. It seemed that people could believe in dope money buried in glass jars, but not in money won for writing poetry. Shortly after this, Clark said, "We could have made him pay." Carla knew at once what he was talking about, but she took it as a joke. "Too late now," she said. "You can't pay once you're dead." "He can't." "She could. She's gone to Greece." "She's not going to stay in Greece." "She didn't know," said Carla more soberly. "I didn't say she did. She doesn't have a clue about it." "We could fix that." Carla said, Number. Clark went on as if she had not spoken. "We could say we're going to sue. People get money for stuff like that all the time." "How could you do that?" "You can't sue a dead person." "Threaten to go to the papers." "Big time poet." "The papers would eat it up." "All we have to do is threaten and she'd cave in." "You're just fantasizing," Carla said. "You're joking." "No," said Clark. "Actually, I'm not." Carla said she did not want to talk about it anymore, and he said okay. But they talked about it the next day, and the next and the next. He sometimes got notions like this that were not practicable, which might even be illegal. He talked about them with growing excitement, and then she wasn't sure why he dropped them. If the rain had stopped, if this had turned into something like a normal summer, he might have let this idea go the way of the others. But that had not happened, and during the last month he had harped on the scheme as if it was perfectly feasible and serious. The question was how much money to ask for. Too little, and the woman might not take them seriously, she might be inclined to see if they were bluffing. Too much might get her back up and she might become stubborn. Carla had stopped saying that it was a joke. Instead, she told him that it wouldn't work. She said that for one thing, people expected poets to be that way. So it wouldn't be worth paying out money to cover it up. He said that it would work if it was done right. Carla was to break down and tell Mrs. Jameson the whole story. Then Clark would move in, as if it had all been a surprise to him. He had just found out. He would be outraged, he would talk about telling the world. He would let Mrs. Jameson be the one who first mentioned money. "You were injured. You were molested and humiliated, and I was injured and humiliated because you are my wife. It's a question of respect." Over and over again he talked to her in this way, and she tried to deflect him, but he insisted. "Promise," he said. "Promise." This was because of what she had told him, things she could not now retract or deny. Sometimes he gets interested in me? The old guy? Sometimes he calls me into the room when she's not there? Yes. When she has to go out shopping and the nurse isn't there either. A lucky inspiration of hers, one that instantly pleased him. So what do you do then? Do you go in? She played shy. Sometimes. He calls you into his room. So? Carla? So, then? I go in to see what he wants. So what does he want? This was asked and told in whispers, even if there was nobody to hear, even when they were in the neverland of their bed. A bedtime story, in which the details were important and had to be added to every time, and this with convincing reluctance, shyness, giggles, dirty, dirty. And it was not only he who was eager and grateful. She was too. Eager to please and excite him, to excite herself. Grateful every time it still worked. And in one part of her mind it was true, she saw the randy old man, the bump he made in the sheet, bedridden indeed, almost beyond speech but proficient in sign language, indicating his desire, trying to nudge and finger her into complicity, into obliging stunts and intimacies. Her refusal a necessity, but also perhaps strangely, slightly disappointing, to Clark. Now and then came an image that she had to hammer down, lest it spoil everything. She would think of the real dim and sheeted body, drugged and shrinking every day in its rendered hospital bed, glimpsed only a few times when Mrs. Jameson or the visiting nurse had neglected to close the door. She herself never actually coming closer to him than that. In fact, she had dreaded going to the Jamesons, but she needed the money, and she felt sorry for Mrs. Jameson, who seemed so haunted and bewildered, as if she was walking in her sleep. Once or twice Carla had burst out and done something really silly just to loosen up the atmosphere. The kind of thing she did when clumsy and terrified first-time horseback riders were feeling humiliated. She used to try that too when Clark was stuck in his moods. It didn't work with him anymore. But the story about Mr. Jameson had worked, decisively. There was no way to avoid the puddles in the path or the tall soaked grass alongside it, or the wild carrot which had recently come into flower. But the air was warm enough so that she didn't get chilly. Her clothes were soaked through as if by her own sweat or the tears that ran down her face with the drizzle of rain. Her weeping petered out in time. She had nothing to wipe her nose and not the paper towel now sogged, but she leaned over and blew it hard into a puddle. She lifted her head and managed the long drawn out, vibrating whistle that was her signal at Clark's to for Flora. She waited a couple of minutes and then called Flora's name. Over and over again, whistle and name, whistle and name. Flora did not respond. It was almost a relief, though, to feel the single pain of missing Flora perhaps forever, compared to the mess she had got into concerning Mrs. Jameson, and her seesaw misery with Clark. At least Flora's leaving was not on account of anything that Carla had done wrong. At the house, there was nothing for Sylvia to do except to open the windows. And to think with an eagerness that dismayed without really surprising Hera of how soon she could see Carla. All the paraphernalia of illness had been removed. The room that had been Sylvia and her husband's bedroom and then his death chamber had been cleaned out and tidied up to look as if nothing had ever happened in it. Carla had helped with all that during the few frenzied days between the crematorium and the departure for Greece. Every piece of clothing Leon had ever worn and some things he hadn't, including gifts from his sisters that had never been taken out of their packages, had been piled in the back seat of the car and delivered to the thrift shop. His pills, his shaving things, unopened cans of the fortified drink that had sustained him as long as anything could, cartons of the sesame seed snaps that at one time he had eaten by the dozens, the plastic bottles full of the lotion that had eased his back, the sheepskins on which he had lain, all of that was dumped into plastic bags to be hauled away as garbage, and Carla didn't question a thing. She never said, maybe somebody could use that, or pointed out that whole cartons of cans were unopened. When Sylvia said, I wish I hadn't taken the clothes to town. I wish I'd burned them all up in the incinerator, Carla had shown no surprise. They cleaned the oven, scrubbed out the cupboards, wiped down the walls and the windows. One day Sylvia sat in the living room going through all the condolence letters she had received. There was no accumulation of papers and notebooks to be attended to, as you might have expected with a writer, no unfinished work or scribbled drafts. He had told her, months before, that he had pitched everything. And no regrets. The south-sloping wall of the house was made up of big windows. Sylvia looked up, surprised by the watery sunlight that had come out or possibly surprised by the shadow of Carla, bare-legged, bare-armed, on top of a ladder, her resolute face crowned with a frizz of dandelion hair that was too short for the braid. She was vigorously spraying and scrubbing the glass. When she saw Sylvia looking at her, she stopped and flung out her arms as if she was played there, making a silly gargoyle-like face. They both began to laugh. Sylvia felt this laughter running all through her like a playful stream. She went back to her letters as Carla resumed the cleaning. She decided that all of these kind words are genuine or perfunctory, the tributes and regrets it could go the way of the sheepskins and the crackers. When she heard Carla taking the ladder down, heard boots on the deck, she was suddenly shy. She sat where she was with her head bowed as Carla came into the room and passed behind her on her way to the kitchen to put the pail and the cloths back under the sink. Carla hardly halted, she was quick as a bird, but she managed to drop a kiss on Sylvia's bent head. Then she went on whistling something to herself. That kiss had been in Sylvia's mind ever since. It meant nothing in particular. It meant cheer up. Or almost done. It meant that they were good friends who had got through a lot of depressing work together. Or maybe just that the sun had come out. That Carla was thinking of getting home to her horses. Nevertheless, Sylvia saw it as a bright blossom, its petals spreading inside her with tumultuous heat, like a menopausal flash. Every so often there had been a special girl student in one of her botany classes, one whose cleverness and dedication and awkward egotism, or even genuine passion for the natural world, reminded her of her young self. Such girls hung around her worshipfully, hoped for some sort of intimacy they could not in most guesses imagine, and they soon got on her nerves. Carla was nothing like them. If she resembled anybody in Sylvia's life, it would have to be certain girls she had known in high school, at those who were bright but never too bright, easy athletes but not strenuously competitive, buoyant but not rambunctious. Naturally happy. Where I was, this little tiny village with my two old friends, well, it was the sort of place where the very occasional tourist bus would stop, just as if it had got lost, and the tourists would get off and look around and they were absolutely bewildered because they weren't anywhere. There was nothing to buy. Sylvia was speaking about Greece. Carla was sitting a few feet away from her. The large-limbed, uncomfortable, dazzling girl was sitting there at last, in the room that had been filled with thoughts of her. She was faintly smiling, belatedly nodding. And at first, Sylvia said, at first I was bewildered too. It was so hot. But it's true about the light. It's wonderful. And then I figured out what there was to do, and there were just these few simple things, but they could fill the day. You walk half a mile down the road to buy some oil and half a mile in the other direction to buy your bread or your wine, and that's the morning, and you eat some lunch under the trees, and after lunch it's too hot to do anything but close the shutters and lie on your bed and maybe read. At first you read. And then it gets so you don't even do that. Why read? Later on you notice the shadows are longer and you get up and go for a swim. Oh, she interrupted herself. Oh, I forgot. She jumped up and went to get the present she had brought, which in fact she had not forgotten about at all. She had not wanted to hand it to Carla right away, she had wanted the moment to come more naturally, and while she was speaking she had thought ahead to the moment when she could mention the sea, going swimming. And say, as she now said, swimming reminded me of this because it's a little replica, you know, it's a little replica of the horse they found under the sea. Cast in bronze. They dredged it up, after all this time. It's supposed to be from the 2nd century BC. When Carla had come in and looked around for work to do, Sylvia had said, "Oh, just sit down a minute, I haven't had anybody to talk to since I got back. Please." Carla had sat down on the edge of a chair, legs apart, hands between her knees, looking somehow desolate. As if reaching for some distant politeness she had said, "How was Greece?" Now she was standing, with a tissue paper crumpled around the horse, which she had not fully unwrapped. "It's said to represent a racehorse," Sylvia said. "Making that final spurt, the last effort in a race. The rider, too, the boy, you can see he's urging the horse onto the limit of its strength." She did not mention that the boy had made her think of Carla, and she could not now have said why. He was only about 10 or 11 years old. Maybe the strength and grace of the arm that must have held the reins, or the wrinkles in his childish forehead, the absorption and the pure effort there was in some way like Carla cleaning the big windows last spring. Her strong legs in her shorts, her broad shoulders, her big swipes at the glass, and then the way she had splayed herself out as a joke, inviting or even commanding Sylvia to laugh. "You can see that," Carla said, now conscientiously examining the little bronzy green statue. "Thank you very much. You are welcome. Let's have coffee, shall we? I've just made some." The coffee in Greece was quite strong, a little stronger than I liked, but the bread was heavenly. And the ripe figs, they were astounding. "Sit down another moment, please do. You should stop me going on and on this way. What about here? How has life been here?" "It's been raining most of the time." "I can see that." "I can see it has," Sylvia called from the kitchen end of the big room. Pouring the coffee, she decided that she would keep quiet about the other gift she had brought. It hadn't cost her anything, the horse had cost more than the girl could probably guess, it was only a beautiful small pinkish white stone she had picked up along the road. "This is for Carla," she had said to her friend Maggie, who was walking beside her. "I know it's silly. I just want her to have a tiny piece of this land." She had already mentioned Carla to Maggie, and to Soraya, her other friend there, telling them how the girl's presence had come to mean more and more to her, how an indescribable bond had seemed to grow up between them, and had consoled her in the awful months of last spring. It was just to see somebody so fresh and full of health coming into the house. Maggie and Soraya had laughed in a kindly but annoying way. "There's always a girl," Soraya said, with an indolent stretch of her heavy brown arms, and Maggie said, "We all come to it sometime. A crush on a girl." Sylvia was obscurely angered by that dated word, a crush. "Maybe it's because Leon and I never had children," she said. "It's stupid. Displaced maternal love." Her friends spoke at the same time, saying in slightly different ways something to the effect that it might be stupid but it was, after all, love. But the girl was not, today, anything like the Carla Sylvia had been remembering, not at all the calm bright spirit, the carefree and generous young creature who had kept her company in Greece. She had been hardly interested in her gift. Almost sullen as she reached out for her mug of coffee. "There was one thing I thought you would have liked a lot," said Sylvia energetically. "The goats. They were quite small even when they were full grown. Some spotty and some white, and they were leaping around up on the rocks just like the spirits of the place." She laughed in an artificial way, she couldn't stop herself. "I wouldn't be surprised if they'd had wreaths on their horns. How is your little goat?" "I forget her name." Carla said, "Flora." "Flora. She's gone." "Gone? Did you sell her?" "She disappeared." "We don't know where?" "Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. But isn't there a chance she'll turn up again?" No answer. Sylvia looked directly at the girl, something that up to now she had not quite been able to do, and saw that her eyes were full of tears, her face blotchy, in fact it looked grubby and that she seemed bloated with distress. She didn't do anything to avoid Sylvia's look. She drew her lips tight over her teeth and shut her eyes and rocked back and forth as if in a soundless howl, and then, shockingly, she did howl. She howled and wept and gulped for air and tears ran down her cheeks and snot out of her nostrils and she began to look around wildly for something to wipe with. Sylvia ran and got handfuls of Kleenex. "Don't worry, here you are, here, you're all right," she said, thinking that maybe the thing to do would be to take the girl in her arms. But she had not the least wish to do that, and it might make things worse. The girl might feel how little Sylvia wanted to do such a thing, how appalled she was in fact by this noisy fit. Carla said the same thing again. "Awful, she said. Awful. No, it's not. We all have to cry sometimes. It's alright, don't worry. It's awful. And Sylvia could not help feeling how, with every moment of this show of misery, the girl made herself more ordinary, more like one of those soggy students in Hera Sylvia's office. Some of them cried about their marks, but that was often tactical, a brief unconvincing bit of whimpering. The more infrequent, real waterworks would turn out to have something to do with a love affair, or their parents, or a pregnancy. It's not about your goat, is it? Number. You better have a glass of water, said Sylvia. She took time to run it cold, trying to think what else she should do or say, and when she returned with it Carla was already calming down. Now, Sylvia said as the water was being swallowed. Isn't that better? Yes. It's not the goat. What is it? Carla said, I can't stand it anymore. What could she not stand? It turned out to be the husband. He was mad at her all the time. He acted as if he hated her. There was nothing she could do right, there was nothing she could say. Living with him was driving her crazy. Sometimes she thought she already was crazy. Sometimes she thought he was. Has he hurt you, Carla? Number. He hadn't hurt her physically. But he hated her. He despised her. He could not stand it when she cried and she could not help crying because he was so mad. She did not know what to do. Perhaps you do know what to do, said Sylvia. Get away? I would if I could. Carla began to wail again. I'd give anything to get away. I can't. I haven't any money. I haven't anywhere in this world to go. Well. Think. Is that altogether true? Said Sylvia in her best counseling manner. Don't you have parents? Didn't you tell me you grew up in Kingston? Don't you have a family there? Her parents had moved to British Columbia. They hated Clark. They didn't care if she lived or died. Brothers or sisters? One brother 9 years older. He was married and in Toronto. He didn't care either. He didn't like Clark. His wife was a snob. Have you ever thought of the women's shelter? They don't want you there unless you've been beaten up. And everybody would find out and it would be bad for our business. Sylvia gently smiled. Is this a time to think about that? Then Carla actually laughed. I know, she said, I'm insane. Listen, said Sylvia. Listen to me. If you had the money to go, would you go? Where would you go? What would you do? I would go to Toronto, Carla said readily enough. But I wouldn't go near my brother. I'd stay in a motel or something and I'd get a job at a riding stable. You think you could do that? I was working at a riding stable the summer I met Clark. I'm more experienced now than I was then. A lot more. You sound as if you figured this out, said Sylvia thoughtfully. Carla said, I have now. So when would you go, if you could go? Now. Today. This minute. All that's stopping you is lack of money? Carla took a deep breath. All that's stopping me, she said. All right, said Sylvia. Now listen to what I propose. I don't think you should go to a motel. I think you should take the bus to Toronto and go to stay with a friend of mine. Her name is Ruth Stiles. She has a big house and she lives alone and she won't mind having somebody to stay. You can stay there till you find a job. I'll help you with some money. There must be lots and lots of riding stables around Toronto. There are. So what do you think? Do you want me to phone and find out what time the bus goes? Carla said yes. She was shivering. She ran her hands up and down her thighs and shook her head roughly from side to side. I can't believe it, she said. I'll pay you back. I mean, thank you. I'll pay you back. I don't know what to say. Sylvia was already at the phone, dialing the bus depot. SHH, I'm getting the times, she said. She listened, and hung up. I know you will. You agree about truths? I'll let her know. There's one problem, though. She looked critically at Carla's shorts and t-shirt. You can't very well go in those clothes. I can't go home to get anything, said Carla in a panic. I'll be all right. The bus will be air-conditioned. You'll freeze. There must be something of mine you could wear. Aren't we about the same height? You're 10 times skinnier. I didn't used to be. In the end they decided on a brown linen jacket, hardly well-earned as Sylvia had considered it to be a mistake for herself, the style too brusque, and a pair of tailored tan pants and a cream-colored silk shirt. Carla's sneakers would have to do with this outfit, because her feet were 2 sizes larger than Sylvia's. Carla went to take a shower, as something she had not bothered with in her state of mind that morning, and Sylvia phoned Ruth. Ruth was going to be out at a meeting that evening, but she would leave the key with her upstairs tenants, and all Carla would have to do was ring their bell. She'll have to take a cab from the bus depot, though. I assume she's okay to manage that? Ruth said. Sylvia laughed. She's not a lame duck, don't worry. She is just a person in a bad situation, the way it happens. Well, good. I mean good she's getting out. Not a lame duck at all, said Sylvia, thinking of Carla trying on the tailored pants and linen jacket. How quickly the young recover from a fit of despair, and how handsome the girl had looked in the fresh clothes. The bus would stop in town at 2:20. Sylvia decided to make omelets for lunch, to set the table with a dark blue cloth, and to get down the crystal glasses and open a bottle of wine. I hope you're hungry enough to eat something, she said, when Carla came out clean and shining in her board clothes. Her softly freckled skin was flushed from the shower, and her hair was damp and darkened, out of its braid, the sweet frizz now flat against her head. She said she was hungry, but when she tried to get a forkful of the omelette to her mouth, her trembling hands made it impossible. I don't know why I'm shaking like this, she said. I must be excited. I never knew it would be this easy. It's very sudden, said Sylvia. Probably it doesn't seem quite real. It does, though. Everything now seems really real. Like the time before now, that's when I was in a daze. Maybe when you make up your mind to something, when you really make up your mind, that's how it is. Or that's how it should be. If you've got a friend, said Carla with a self-conscious smile and a flush spreading over her forehead. If you've got a true friend. I mean like you. She laid down the knife and fork and raised her wineglass awkwardly with both hands. Drinking to a true friend, she said, uncomfortably. I probably shouldn't even take a sip, but I will. Me too, said Sylvia with a pretense of gaiety. She drank, but spoiled the moment by saying, Are you going to phone him? Or what? He'll have to know. At least he'll have to know where you are by the time he'd be expecting you home. Not the phone, said Carla, alarmed. I can't do it. Maybe if you know, said Sylvia. Number. No, that's stupid. I shouldn't have said that. It's just hard to think straight. What I maybe should do, I should put a note in the mailbox. But I don't want him to get it too soon. I don't want us to even drive past there when we're going into town. I want to go the back way. So if I write it, could you maybe slip it in the box when you come back? Sylvia agreed to this, seeing no good alternative. She brought pen and paper. She poured a little more wine. Carla sat thinking, then wrote a few words. I have gone away. I will be all right. These were the words that Sylvia read when she unfolded the paper, on her way back from the bus depot. She was sure Carla knew right from right. It was just that she had been talking about writing a note, and she was in a state of exalted confusion. More confusion perhaps than Sylvia had realized. The wine had brought out a stream of talk, but it had not seemed to be accompanied by any particular grief or upset. She had talked about the horse barn where she had worked and met Clark when she was 18 and just out of high school. Her parents wanted her to go to college, and she had agreed as long as she could choose to be a veterinarian. All she really wanted, and had wanted all her life, was to work with animals and live in the country. She had been one of those dorky girls in high school, one of those girls they made rotten jokes about, but she didn't care. Clark was the best writing teacher they had. Scads of women were after him, they would take up writing just to get him as their teacher. Carla teased him about his women, and at first he seemed to like it, then he got annoyed. She apologized and tried to make up for it by getting him talking about his dream or his plan, really to have a writing school, a horse stable, someplace out in the country. One day she came into the stable and saw him hanging up his saddle and realized she had fallen in love with him. Now she considered it was sex. It was probably just sex. When fall came and she was supposed to quit working and leave for college in Guelph, she refused to go. She said she needed a year off. Clark was very smart, but he hadn't waited even to finish high school. He had altogether lost touch with his family. He thought families were like a poison in your blood. He had been an attendant in a mental hospital, a disc jockey on a radio station in Lethbridge, Alberta, a member of a road crew on the highways near Thunder Bay, an apprentice barber, a salesman in an army surplus store. And those were only the jobs he told her about. She had nicknamed him Gypsy Rover, because of the song, an old song her mother used to sing. Now she took to singing it around the house all the time, and her mother knew something was up. Last night she slept in a feather bed with a silken quilt for cover. Tonight she'll sleep on the cold hard ground beside her Gypsy Lover. Her mother said, "He'll break your heart, that's a sure thing." Her stepfather, who was an engineer, did not even grant Clark that much power. A loser, he called him. One of those drifters. As if Clark was a bug he could just whisk off his clothes. So Carla said, "Does a drifter save up enough money to buy a farm?" Which, by the way, he has done. And he only said, "I'm not about to argue with you." She was not his daughter anyway, he added, as if that was the clincher. So, naturally, Carla had to run away with Clark. The way her parents behaved, they were practically guaranteeing it. "Will you get in touch with your parents after you're settled?" Sylvia said. "In Toronto?" Carla lifted her eyebrows, pulled in her cheeks and made a saucy O of her mouth. She said, "Nope. Definitely a little drunk." Back home, having left the note in the mailbox, Sylvia cleaned up the dishes that were still on the table, washed and polished the omelette pan, threw the blue napkins and tablecloth in the laundry basket, and opened the windows. She did this with a confusing sense of regret and irritation. She had put out a fresh cake of apple-scented soap for the girls' shower, and the smell of it lingered in the house, as it had in the air of the car. The rain was holding off. She could not stay still, so she went for a walk along the path that Leon had cleared. The gravel he had dumped in the boggy places had mostly washed away. They used to go walking every spring, to look for wild orchids. She taught him the name of every wildflower, all of which, except for trillium, he forgot. He used to call her his Dorothy Wordsworth. Last spring she went out once and picked him a small bunch of dog's tooth violets, but he looked at Emma as he sometimes looked at Hera, with mere exhaustion, disavowal. She kept seeing Carla stepping onto the bus. Her thanks had been sincere but already almost casual, her wave jaunty. She had got used to her salvation. Back in the house, at around 6 o'clock, Sylvia put in a call to Toronto, to Ruth, knowing that Carla would not have arrived yet. She got the answering machine. "Ruth," said Sylvia. "Sylvia. It's about this girl I sent you. I hope she doesn't turn out to be a bother to you. I hope it'll be alright. You may find her a little full of herself. Maybe it's just youth. Let me know. Okay?" She phoned again before she went to bed but got the machine, so she said, "Sylvia again. Just checking," and hung up. It was between 9 and 10 o'clock, not even really dark. Ruth must still be out, and the girl would not want to pick up the phone in a strange house. She tried to think of the name of Ruth's upstairs tenants. They surely wouldn't have gone to bed yet. But she could not remember. And just as well. Phoning them would have meant making too much of a fuss, being too anxious, going too far. She got into the bed, but it was impossible to stay there, so she took a light quilt and went out to the living room and lay down on the sofa, where she had slept for the last 3 months of Leon's life. She did not think it likely that she would get to sleep there either. There were no curtains on the bank of windows, and she could tell by the look of the sky that the moon had risen, though she could not see it. The next thing she knew, she was on a bus somewhere in Greece. With a lot of people she did not know, and the engine of the bus was making an alarming knocking sound. She woke to find the knocking was at her front door. Carla? Carla had kept her head down until the bus was clear of town. The windows were tinted, Nobody could see in, but she had to guard herself against seeing out. Lest Clark appear coming out of a store or waiting to cross the street, all ignorant of her abandoning him, thinking this an ordinary afternoon. No, thinking it the afternoon when their his skmia was put in motion, eager to know how far she had got with it. Once they were out in the country, she looked up, breathed deeply, took account of the fields, which were slightly violet-tinted through the glass. Mrs. Jamieson's presence had surrounded her with some kind of remarkable safety and sanity, and had made her escape seem the most rational thing you could imagine, in fact the only self-respecting thing that a person in Carla's shoes could do. Carla had felt herself capable of an unaccustomed confidence, even of a mature sense of humor, revealing her life to Mrs. Jamieson in a way that seemed bound to gain sympathy and yet to be ironic and truthful. And adapted to live up to what, as far as she could see, were Mrs. Jamieson's as Sylvia's expectations. She did have a feeling that it would be possible to disappoint Mrs. Jamieson, who struck her as a most sensitive and rigorous person, but she thought that she was in no danger of doing that. If she didn't have to be around her for too long. The sun was shining, as it had been for some time. When they sat at lunch it had made the wine glasses sparkle. No rain had fallen since early morning. There was enough of a wind blowing to lift the roadside grass, the flowering weeds, out of their drenched clumps. Summer clouds, not rain clouds, were scudding across the sky. The whole countryside was changing, shaking itself loose, into the true brightness of a July day. And as they sped along she was able to see not much trace at all of the recent pasta, no big puddles in the fields, showing where the seed had washed out, no miserable spindly cornstalks or a large grain. It occurred to her that she must tell Clark about these, that perhaps they had chosen what was for some freakish reason a very wet and dreary corner of the country, and there were other places where they could have been successful. Or could be yet? Then it came to her of course that she would not be telling Clark anything. Never again. She would not be concerned about what happened to him, or to Grace or Mike or Juniper or Blackberry or Lizzie Borden. If by any chance Flora came back, she would not hear of it. This was her second time to leave everything behind. The first time was just like the old Beatles song, her putting the note on the table and slipping out of the house at 5 o'clock in the morning, meeting Clark in the church parking lot down the street. She was actually humming that song as they rattled away. She's leaving home, bye-bye. She recalled now how the sun was coming up behind them, how she looked at Clark's hands on the wheel, the dark hairs on his competent forearms, and breathed in the smell of the inside of the truck, a smell of oil and metal, tools and horse barns. The cold air of the fall morning blew in through the truck's rusted seams. It was the sort of vehicle that nobody in her family ever rode in, that scarcely ever appeared on the streets where they lived. Clark's preoccupation on that morning with the traffic, they had reached Highway 401, his concern about the truck's behavior, his curt answers, his narrowed eyes, even his slight irritation at her giddy delight at all of that thrilled her. As did the disorder of his past life, his avowed loneliness, the tender way he could have with a horse, and with her. She saw him as the architect of the life ahead of them, herself as captive, her submission both proper and exquisite. "You don't know what you're leaving behind," her mother wrote to her, in that one letter that she received, and never answered. But in those shivering moments of early morning flight she certainly did know what she was leaving behind, even if she had rather a hazy idea of what she was going to. She despised her parents, their house, their backyard, their photo albums, their vacations, their Cuisinart, their powder room, their walk-in closets, their underground lawn sprinkling system. In the brief note she had written she had used the word authentic. "I have always felt the need of a more authentic kind of life. I know I cannot expect you to understand this." The bus had stopped now at the first town on the way. The depot was a gas station. It was the very station she and Clark used to drive to, in their early days, to buy cheap gas. In those days their world had included several towns in the surrounding countryside, and they had sometimes behaved like tourists, sampling the specialties in grimy hotel bars. Pig's feet, sauerkraut, potato pancakes, beer. And they would sing all the way home like crazy hillbillies. But after a while all outings came to be seen as a waste of time and money. They were what people did before they understood the realities of their lives. She was crying now, her eyes had filled up without her realizing it. She set herself to thinking about Toronto, the first steps ahead. The taxi, the house she had never seen, the strange bed she would sleep in alone. Looking in the phone book tomorrow for the addresses of riding stables, then getting to wherever they were, asking for a job. She could not picture it. Herself riding on the subway or streetcar, caring for new horses, talking to new people, living among hordes of people every day who were not Clark. A life, a place, chosen for that specific reason that it would not contain Clark. The strange and terrible thing coming clear to her about that world of the future, as she now pictured it, was that she would not exist there. She would only walk around, and open her mouth and speak, and do this and do that. She would not really be there. And what was strange about it was that she was doing all this, she was riding on this bus in the hope of recovering herself. As Mrs. Jameson might say, and as she herself might with satisfaction have said, taking charge of her own life. With nobody glowering over her, nobody's mood infecting her with misery. But what would she care about? How would she know that she was alive? While she was running away from him, and now Clark still kept his place in her life. But when she was finished running away, when she just went on, what would she put in his place? What Elsia, who Elsia could ever be so vivid a challenge? She had managed to stop crying, but she had started to shake. She was in a bad way and would have to take hold, get a grip on herself. Get a grip on yourself, Clark had sometimes told her, passing through a room where she was scrunched up, trying not to weep, and that indeed was what she must do. They had stopped in another town. This was the third town away from the one where she had got on the bus, which meant that they had passed through the second town without her even noticing. The bus must have stopped, the driver must have called out the name, and she had not heard or seen anything in her fog of fright. Soon enough they would reach the major highway, they would be tearing along towards Toronto. And she would be lost. She would be lost. What would be the point of getting into a taxi and giving the new address, of getting up in the morning and brushing her teeth and going into the world? Why should she get a job, put food in her mouth, be carried by public transportation from place to place? Her feet seemed now to be at some enormous distance from her body. Her knees, in the unfamiliar crisp pants, were weighted with irons. She was sinking to the ground like a stricken horse who will never get up. Already the bus had loaded on the few passengers and the parcels that had been waiting in this town. A woman and a baby in its stroller were waving somebody goodbye. The building behind them, the cafe that served as a bus stop, was also in motion. A liquefying wave passed through the bricks and windows as if they were about to dissolve. In peril of her life, Carla pulled her huge body, her iron limbs, forward. She stumbled, she cried out, "Let me off!" The driver braked, he called out irritably, "I thought you were going to Toronto?" People gave her casually curious looks, nobody seemed to understand that she was in anguish. "I have to get off here. There's a washroom in the back. Number. I have to get off. I'm not waiting. You understand that? You got luggage underneath. Number. Yes. Number. No luggage." A voice in the bus said, "Claustrophobia. That's what's the matter with her." "You sick?" said the driver. Number. I just want off." Okay. Fine by me. Come and get me. Please. Come and get me. I will. Sylvia had forgotten to lock her door. She realized that she should be locking it now, not opening it, but it was too late, she had it open. And nobody there. Yet she was sure, the knocking had been real. She closed the door and this time she locked it. There was a playful sound, a tinkling tapping sound, coming from the wall of windows. She switched the light on, but saw nothing there, and switched it off again. Some animal, maybe a squirrel? The French doors that opened between windows, leading to the patio, had not been locked either. Not even really closed, having been left open an inch or so from her airing of the house. She started to close them and somebody laughed, nearby, near enough to be in the room with her. "It's me," a man said. "Did I scare you?" He was pressed against the glass, he was right beside her. "It's Clark," he said. Clark from down the road. She was not going to ask him in, but she was afraid to shut the door in his face. He could grab it before she could manage that. She didn't want to turn on the light, either. She slept in a long t-shirt. She should have pulled the quilt from the sofa and wrapped it around herself, but it was too late now. "Did you want to get dressed?" he said. "What I got in here, it could be the very things you need." He had a shopping bag in his hand. He thrust it at her, but did not try to come with it. "What?" she said in a choppy voice. "Look and see. It's not a bomb. There, take it." She felt inside the bag, not looking. Something soft. And then she recognized the buttons of the jacket, the silk of the shirt, the belt on the pants. "Just thought you'd better have them back," he said. "They're yours, aren't they?" She tightened her jaws so that her teeth wouldn't chatter. A fearful dryness had attacked her mouth and throat. "I understood they were yours," he said softly. Her tongue moved like a wad of wool. She forced herself to say, "Where's Carla?" "You mean my wife Carla?" Now she could see his face more clearly. She could see how he was enjoying himself. "My wife Carla is home in bed. Asleep in bed. Where she belongs." He was both a handsome man and a silly-looking man. Tall, lean, well-built, but with a slouch that seemed artificial. A contrived, self-conscious air of menace. A lock of dark hair falling over his forehead, a vain little mustache, eyes that appeared both hopeful and mocking, a boyish smile perpetually on the verge of a sulk. She had always disliked the sight of him as she had mentioned her dislike to Leon, who said that the man was just unsure of himself, just a bit too friendly. The fact that he was unsure of himself would not make her any safer now. "Pretty worn out," he said. "After her little adventure. You should have seen your face, you should have seen the look on you when you recognized those clothes. What did you think? Did you think I'd murdered her?" "I was surprised," said Sylvia. "I bet you were. After you were such a big help to her running away." "I helped her," Sylvia said with considerable effort. "I helped her because she seemed to be in distress." "Distress," he said, as if examining the word. "I guess she was. She was in very big distress when she jumped off that bus and got on the phone to me to come and get her. She was crying so hard I could hardly make out what it was she was saying." "She wanted to come back?" "Oh yeah. You bet she wanted to come back. She was in real hysterics to come back. She is a girl who is very up and down in her emotions. But I guess you don't know her as well as I do. She seemed quite happy to be going." "Did she really? Well, I have to take your word for it. I didn't come here to argue with you." Sylvia said nothing. "I came here to tell you I don't appreciate you interfering in my life with my wife." "She is a human being," said Sylvia, though she knew it would be better if she could keep quiet. "Besides being your wife." "My goodness, is that so? My wife is a human being? Really? Thank you for the information. But don't try getting smart with me." "Sylvia. I wasn't trying to get smart." "Good. I'm glad you weren't. I don't want to get mad. I just have a couple of important things to say to you. One thing, that I don't want you sticking your nose in anywhere, anytime, in my wife's life. Another, that I'm not going to want her coming around here anymore. Not that she is going to particularly want to come, I'm pretty sure of that. She doesn't have too good an opinion of you at the moment. And it's time you learned how to clean your own house." "Now," he said. "Now. Has that sunk in?" "Quite sufficiently." "Oh, I really hope it has." "I hope so." Sylvia said, "Yes. And you know what else I think?" "What?" "I think you owe me something." "What?" "I think maybe you owe me an apology." Sylvia said, "All right. If you think so. I'm sorry." He shifted, perhaps just to put out his hand, and with a movement of his body she shrieked. He laughed. He put his hand on the door frame to make sure she didn't close it. "What's that?" "What's what?" he said, as if she was trying out a trick and it would not work. But then he caught sight of something reflected in the window, and he snapped around to look. Not far from the house was a wide shallow patch of land that often filled up with night fog at this time of year. The fog was there tonight, had been there all this while. But now at one point there was a change. The fog had thickened, taken on a separate shape, transformed itself into something spiky and radiant. First a live dandelion ball, tumbling forward, then condensing itself into an unearthly sort of animal, pure white, hell-bent, something like a giant unicorn, rushing at them. "Jesus Christ," Clark said softly and devoutly. And grabbed hold of Sylvia's shoulder. This touch did not alarm her at all as she accepted it with the knowledge that he did it either to protect her or to reassure himself. Then the vision exploded. Out of the fog, and out of the magnifying light now seemed to be that of a car traveling along this back road, probably in search of a place to park. Out of this appeared a white goat. A little dancing white goat, hardly bigger than a sheepdog. Clark let go. He said, "Where the Christ did you come from?" "It's your goat," said Sylvia. "Isn't it your goat?" "Flora," he said. Flora. The goat had stopped a yard or so away from them, had turned shy and hung her head. "Flora," Clark said. "Where the hell did you come from? You scared the shit out of us." "Us?" Flora came closer but still did not look up. She butted against Clark's legs. "Goddamn stupid animal," he said shakily. "Where'd you come from?" "She was lost," said Sylvia. "Yeah. She was. Never thought we'd see her again, actually." Flora looked up. The moonlight caught a glitter in her eyes. "Scared the shit out of us," Clark said to her. "Were you off looking for a boyfriend?" "Scared the shit. Didn't you? We thought you were a ghost." "It was the effect of the fog," Sylvia said. She stepped out of the door now, onto the patio. "Quite safe." "Yeah." Then the lights of that car. "Like an apparition," he said, recovering. And pleased that he had thought of this description. "Yes. The goat from outer space. That's what you are. You're a goddamn goat from outer space," he said, patting Flora. But when Sylvia put out her free hand to do the same, her other hand still held the bag of clothes that Carla had worn. Flora immediately lowered her head as if to prepare for some serious butting. "Goats are unpredictable," Clark said. "They can seem tame but they're not really. Not after they grow up." "Is she grown up?" "She looks so small. She's big as she's ever going to get." They stood looking down at the goat, as if expecting she would provide them with more conversation. But this was apparently not going to happen. From this moment they could go neither forward nor back. Sylvia believed that she might have seen a shadow of regret cross his face that this was so. But he acknowledged it. He said, "It's late." "I guess it is," said Sylvia, just as if this had been an ordinary visit. "Okay, Flora. Time for us to go home. I'll make other arrangements for help if I need it," she said. "I probably won't need it now, anyway." She added almost laughingly, "I'll stay out of your hair." "Sure," he said. "You better get inside. You'll get cold. People used to think night fogs were dangerous. That's a new one on me. So good night," she said. "Good night, Flora." The phone rang then. "Excuse me." He raised a hand and turned away. "Good night." It was Ruth on the phone. "Ah," Sylvia said. A change in plans. She did not sleep, thinking of the little goat, whose appearance out of the fog seemed to her more and more magical. She even wondered if, possibly, Leon could have had something to do with it. If she was a poet, she would write a poem about something like this. But in her experience, the subjects that she thought a poet could write about did not appeal to Leon. Carla had not heard Clark go out, but she woke when he came in. He told her that he had just been out checking around the barn. "A car went along the road a while ago and I wondered what they were doing here. I couldn't get back to sleep till I went out and checked whether everything was okay. So was it? Far as I could see. And then while I was up," he said, "I thought I might as well pay a visit up the road. I took the clothes back." Carla sat up in bed. "You didn't wake her up?" "She woke up. It was okay. We had a little talk." Oh. It was okay. You didn't mention any of that stuff, did you? I didn't mention it. It really was all made up. It really was. You have to believe me. It was all a lie. Okay. You have to believe me. Then I believe you. I made it all up. Okay. He got into bed. Your feet are cold, she said. Like they got wet. Heavy dew. Come here, he said. When I read your note, it was just like I went hollow inside. It's true. If you ever went away, I'd feel like I didn't have anything left in me. The bright weather had continued. On the streets, in the stores, in the post office, people greeted each other by saying that summer had finally arrived. The pasture grass and even the poor beaten crops lifted up their heads. The puddles dried up, the mud turned to dust. A light warm wind blew and everybody felt like doing things again. The phone rang. Inquiries about trail rides, about riding lessons. Summer camps were interested now, having canceled their trips to museums. Minivans drew up, with their loads of restless children. The horses pranced along the fences, freed from their blankets. Clark had managed to get hold of a large enough piece of roofing at a good price. He had spent the whole first day after Runaway Day, that was how they referred to Carla's bus trip, fixing the roof of the exercise ring. For a couple of days, as they went about their chores, he and Carla would wave at each other. If she happened to pass close to him, and there was nobody else around, Carla might kiss his shoulder through the light material of his summer shirt. If you ever try to run away on me again, I'll tan your hide, he said to her, and she said, would you? What? Tan my hide? Damn right. He was high-spirited now, irresistible as when she had first known him. Birds were everywhere. Red-winged blackbirds, robins, a pair of doves that sang at daybreak. Lots of crows, and gulls on reconnoitering missions from the lake, and big turkey buzzards that sat in the branches of a dead oak about half a mile away, at the edge of the woods. At first they just sat there, drying out their voluminous wings, lifting themselves occasionally for a trial flight, flapping around a bit, then composing themselves to let the sun and the warm air do their work. In a day or so they were restored, flying high, circling and dropping to earth, disappearing over the woods, coming back to rest in the familiar bare tree. Lizzie's own Joy Tucker showed up again, tanned and friendly. She had just got sick of the rain and gone off on her holidays to hike in the Rocky Mountains. Now she was back. Perfect timing weather-wise, Clark said. He and Joy Tucker were soon joking as if nothing had happened. Lizzie looks to be in good shape, she said. But where's her little friend? What's her name, Flora? Gone, said Clark. Maybe she took off to the Rocky Mountains. Lots of wild goats out there. With fantastic horns. So I hear. For 3 or 4 days they had been just too busy to go down and look in the mailbox. When Carla opened it she found the phone bill, some promise that if they subscribed to a certain magazine they could win $1 million, and Mrs. Jameson's letter. My dear Carla, I have been thinking about the, rather dramatic, events of the last few days and I find myself talking to myself but really to you, so often that I thought I must speak to you, even if the best way I can do now only in a letter. And don't worry, you do not have to answer me. Mrs. Jameson went on to say that she was afraid that she had involved herself too closely in Carla's life and had made the mistake of thinking somehow that Carla's happiness and freedom were the same thing. All she cared for was Carla's happiness, and she saw now that Carla must find that in her marriage. All she could hope was that perhaps Carla's flight and turbulent emotions had brought her true feelings to the surface, and perhaps a recognition in her husband of his true feelings as well. She said that she would perfectly understand if Carla had a wish to avoid her in the future, and that she would always be grateful for Carla's presence in her life during such a difficult time. The strangest and most wonderful thing in this whole string of events seems to me the reappearance of Flora. In fact, it seems rather like a miracle. Where had she been all the time, and why did she choose just that moment for her reappearance? I am sure your husband has described it to you. We were talking at the patio door, and Ia facing out was the first to see this white something descending on us out of the night. Of course it was the effect of the ground fog. But truly terrifying. I think I shrieked out loud. I had never in my life felt such bewitchment, in the true sense. I suppose I should be honest and say fear. There we were, two adults, frozen, and then out of the fog comes little last Flora. There has to be something special about this. I know of course that Flora is an ordinary little animal and that she probably spent her time away and getting herself pregnant. In a sense her return has no connection at all with our human lives. Yet her appearance at that moment did have a profound effect on your husband and me. When two human beings divided by hostility are both, at the same time, mystified and frightened by the same apparition, there is a bond that springs up between them, and they find themselves united in the most unexpected way. United in their humanity, that is the only way I can describe it. We parted almost as friends. So Flora has her place as a good angel in my life and perhaps also in your husband's life and yours. With all my good wishes, Sylvia Jameson. As soon as Carla had read this letter she crumpled it up. Then she burned it in the sink. The flames leapt up alarmingly and she turned on the tap, then scooped up the soft disgusting black stuff and put it down the toilet as she should have done in the first place. She was busy for the rest of that day, and the next, and the next. During that time she had to take 2 parties out on the trails, she had to give lessons to children, individually and in groups. At night when Clark put his arms around her busy as he was now, he was never too tired, never cross, as she did not find it hard to be cooperative. It was as if she had a murderous needle somewhere in her lungs, and by breathing carefully, she could avoid feeling it. But every once in a while she had to take a deep breath, and it was still there. Sylvia had taken an apartment in the college town where she taught. The house was not up for sale, or at least there wasn't a sign out in front of it. Leon Jameson had got some kind of posthumous award and news of this was in the papers. There was no mention this time of any money. As the dry golden days of fall came anon, encouraging and profitable season, Carla found that she had got used to the sharp thought that had lodged in her. It wasn't so sharp anymore, in fact, it no longer surprised her. And she was inhabited now by an almost seductive notion, a constant low-lying temptation. She had only to raise her eyes, she had only to look in one direction, to know where she might go. An evening walk, once her chores for the day were finished. To the edge of the woods, and the bare tree where the buzzards had held their party. And then the little dirty bones in the grass. The skull with perhaps some shreds of bloodied skin clinging to it. A skull that she could hold like a teacup in one hand. Knowledge in one hand. Or perhaps not. Nothing there. Other things could have happened. He could have chased Flora away. Or tied her in the back of the truck and driven some distance and set her loose. Taken her back to the place they'd got her from. Not to have her around, reminding them. She might be free. The days passed and Carla didn't go near that place. She held out against the temptation,